Okay, so her brother was visiting us. He had dreadlocks, and so when he went back to the professor's house, the police followed him and they asked this professor, "Do you actually live here?" So the question I want to pose essentially is, what kind of society do we want? That is the question I pose to all of us over here. What is the kind of society do we want? Okay, say we achieve all of our so-called sustainability goals, which is 100% recycling tomorrow. And then we get 100% renewable energy tomorrow. And then we get, all LEED platinum buildings tomorrow. But if we continue to have, young African-American men and women shot, and then, people getting questioned, what's the point? I don't want this kind of society. I don't want to be in it. So these are the big questions that we need to ask. And then the question then is whether these two are separate, which is the operational component and then the racial justice component. Are they actually separate? What I submit is that they're not. They are in fact tightly interlinked. And so the way to integrate them is to question essentially, what is a healthy society? Right now, what we take for granted as the structures in a society is like normal. This is natural. And what I submit is, it is not natural. It is in fact insane. We live in a consumer culture in the United States, and consumer culture is essentially deeply embedded in oppression, extraction, and racism and those kind of things. Without the foundation of racism, slavery, extraction, oppression, dispossession, this society wouldn't exist. And so for this particular society, these are very uncomfortable questions to grapple with, because the foundation is white supremacy. So these are extremely uncomfortable questions that this profession in particular needs to grapple with. What I submit is the environmental degradation that we see is a symptom, but the core issues are the issues of inequity and injustice, racial inequity in the US and injustice. These are the core issues. And unless we relate the two, the inequity and the environmental issues, we're always going to be grappling with resolving symptoms as opposed to resolving the core issue, which is inequity and injustice. So I might end up confusing some of you folks over here. That's not, of course, not my intention. I'm open to questions, but the reality is that the marginalized classes, which are largely Black and brown bodies, aside from the institutional violence, the structural violence that is inflicted on them, which is the police shooting them and so on and so forth, there is also a daily form of violence, which is the wage theft, because they work in minimum wage or less than minimum wage positions. So the economic structures actually enforce the racism, basically. So the product of their labor is not compensated adequately. So they're stuck, they're shackled within their class essentially. Whereas the wealthier classes, which are frequently white, they get to expand their wealth. But it is often on the backs of Black and brown labor. So this is one area which is not adequately addressed within the sustainability profession. We only deal with disposal frequently, waste and those kind of things, and renewable energy, those kind of things. But we never deal with the whole picture. And while this is too small of a period to cover the whole picture, what I want to submit is we need to get everyone thinking about this. So that is my very humble submission to you folks. Really, instead of me just talking over here and I can talk till the cows come home, I would prefer to have questions posed from some of you folks or a discussion going at this point.
Kimberly, you're on mute, I think.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Raghu, I was just saying that that's some very powerful insight that you shared with us. And I think I have some follow-up questions, but before I go to that, I just want to welcome Shay to the conversation. And if I get back to my gallery view, there we go. Shay, I see you over there, but your name says Kimberly Smith. Can you just quickly rename yourself?
I don't even understand why it It comes up as that. That's
Because I sent you a link that was, yeah, that's why.
I just saw that when you said that. Well, I can be Kimberly today, but
Yeah, I'm realizing that, yes. And I'd like to give you a chance to sort of weigh in. We're kind of just, we just started out, and Raghu was helping to make the connection about why sustainability professionals should be concerned about racial equity and social justice. You want to add some thoughts to that?
Let's see. I mean, how many folk are returning from last week? I guess I should ask that. Why should you? I mean, because it impacts you directly. I mean, I think in the simplest form, it is, you know, as we're working in this world together and moving forward, we have to understand that our liberation is intertwined. And so in everything that we're doing, you know, for sustainability, for the environment, you know, that has everything to do with what we are doing around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure, like, if you think about the linkages between, you know, social determinants of health, environmental determinants of health. I mean, I could go on and on about why that is, but the fact that, I mean, how many are on the call today? I'm like looking, it's probably a couple hundred.
About 150, I think, at this point.
About 150. So to me, like, I don't even have to tell you why that is. You're here. So it'd be me sort of like, for lack of a better phrase, preaching to the front pew. And you know, we cannot do this work without each other. And I am, you know, one of the things, what is the other speaker's name? I'm like trying Raghu was saying before I got here, I'm really interested in your questions. I know last week, we weren't able to answer a lot of your questions. So I could talk all day about why it's important. It's because our liberation's intertwined. We cannot do this work without each other. It is integrated in every way. It is what is inexplicably linked, and you know, it's not even a question, right?
Yeah.
And that's why you're here today. So, you know, if you want to get into some deeper subject matter, we can.
Okay, and I do. And we have 2 questions so far. So let's go ahead and just jump to some questions, and we'll come back and deal with some of the other ones. Nakia, I'm not seeing the questions on your doc, so I'll just go to the ones that are in the chat. Especially since, you know, this is I'm grateful that the speakers are open to just taking questions on the fly, because we really want this to be a conversation. Okay, so how about this? I'm gonna open the mics for the participants. And look, I've been on Zoom calls with I think the most I was on a call was with 700 people. And when one person started asking the question at the same time as another person, they just acquiesced to the other. So I'm just gonna ask that we just do the same. If you hear someone else starting to talk, just step back and we'll get to you. So first question, who wants to go? All right, let's not be scaredy cats today. Go for it.
This is Justin Mogg at the University of Louisville, and I just got off another call with our Sustainability Council talking about, you know, how we help support the university-wide anti-racism agenda. Our president has said she wants us to be the most anti-racist university in America or something wonderful like that. But I'm just wondering, great, how do we measure it? I mean, there's, like everything in sustainability, so many things we could do. So I wonder what the thoughts are on how we best measure a university's work towards anti-racism and this collective liberation that you talked about. I think for a lot of us in the sustainability coordination field, we rely on things like STARS to help us guide our work. And it's easy to say these words and really hard to know exactly what to do. So would love any thoughts on, like, what would a STARS credit about this look like?
Fantastic question.
Yes,
Justin.
it is.
The problem is there are no metrics right now for that. That is the big problem. And I would submit that there are no metrics, and that's not an accident. It is by design.
Yes.
Because it is helpful to maintain these structures of oppression and racism and all that. There's benefit to some people. So it's best not to measure this kind of stuff. So what I would challenge our community, and we're still a relatively small community, although there's about 130 people on this call, is to start researching these metrics, because these are important metrics. But right now, for everything that is most important in this society, for what we need to have as a healthy society, we don't have adequate metrics for that. It is a deep lack or a gaping hole. And we need more research along these lines. Like, so say we want to measure racism on campus. Is there a metric? No, there isn't one. Gender oppression, is there a metric? No, there isn't one. So these are gaping holes, and these are not this is not an accident. This is by design. Because in many cases, academia, does operate, we have to acknowledge, as part of the establishment. So academia itself needs to take a deep look within to see whether they're actually fulfilling the expectations of what we need to have a healthy society, or is it just primarily concerned with consumption and production?
Okay.
So I don't know. This is not probably the answer that you were looking for, but we don't have good metrics for this at this point.
Okay. Thank you, Raghu. I'm going to ask if Shay do you want to weigh in on that, Shay?
I think one of the biggest things is when we talk about metrics is also like, what are you going to do with those metrics, right? I think that's the important thing. Is a lot of times people want to collect the data and see if we're moving the needle, but what do you end up doing with those metrics? I think is something that's important. And so when I think about the question about, like, especially when you have this rhetoric around, we're going to be like, known to be the anti-racist campus, like we are going to set a model for that, right? What does that look like for you? What does that look like for sustainability, right? So you're asking what does it look like is it the University of Louisville? I think, is that what you said it was? So what does that look, right? And then you have to think about, like, if you're integrating this in every area of the institution, what does that look like for every area of the institution? And so what does that look like for your work? And if you were to do metrics, who do you do your assessments with, right? To get your baseline, to see where you're starting, to see if you're actually moving the needle. What audiences are you surveying? Like, and what are you talking to? Who are you talking to? And then what are you going to do with that information? And then how are you asking the questions, right? Are you asking questions from a deficit framework? Are you asking questions to say, like, this is what support would look like in your community, right? Because even how you ask the questions matter. So, in your question, I have so many questions about, like, how to, like, appropriately tailor it towards your area. And again, I'll go with Raghu, like there isn't sort of this one size fits all template out there. You're gonna have to figure out what's gonna work for your area, and you're gonna have to create those metrics, but you have to ask yourself, like, do you have the resources and the agency to be able to address whatever comes up when you start asking these questions?
Excellent point, Shay. Thank you. I believe, Megan, you wanted to say something to this question?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's a really great question. And Justin, I really appreciate you raising it, and recognize that a lot of folks that are in the business of needing to collect data for campus sustainability and sort of in STARS on a daily basis, this seems like an easy answer. And yet, for the reasons that Raghu and Shay just listed, it's complicated. However, I wanted to really acknowledge the STARS program manager, Chris Pelton, who's been working with the STARS steering committee and our STARS technical advisor, a group of technical advisors on this topic. And I'll say they have a draft of diversity, equity, and inclusion credits related to this. And for all the reasons Shay just said, as well as Raghu, that's a starting point. It is not an end point. And even in the chat here, you can see some folks saying that, like, those are just the metrics, right? It's the conversations, the actions, the impact, like Shay was just saying, that we need to tie together here within STARS. So I'll say there's definitely conversations happening right now to this effect, Justin. Probably is not going to be available as quickly as we would all like them to be available. But I think whatever it is that we're able to put forth, whether it's in STARS 3.0 or before then, it is going to be a starting point, by no means an end point. Thanks, Kimberly, for letting me jump in.
No problem. Okay, next question or next comment on this same question. I think Angela is next, and then Aswani. So Angela, is your statement in relation to this question? If it's not, I will come back to you after Aswani.
It's a new question, actually.
Okay, so hang on one second. I want to stay on this subject first, but thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, Ashwani.
Hi, folks. Such a pleasure to be here. So, two things I'll say. One, I came in late. I came while Raghu was speaking. And so that's the rhythm that I have. And I was really drawn in by what he was saying.
Yeah.
It was a very powerful statement, Raghu. Thank you for that. Honestly, that's what I felt like doing, was clapping in real time.
Me too. Me too.
Very well done. So, and this question of metrics that was put by Jeff, was it?
Justin.
Justin, is absolutely on point. Right? How do we know? How do we know that we're making a difference? That's really the nub of the matter. So I come at this from a slightly different place than Raghu. And I take some risk in saying this because it's easily misunderstood, I'm sure of that, largely because I haven't thought it through completely. To me, racism per se is secondary to equity. Okay? What I mean by that is that in my mind, I don't see myself as colored. I don't. My wife is Italian. She has to remind me, you're not paying attention here. There's something racist going on in the way you're being dealt with. And she has to remind me of this. I don't think of it. I don't go there. The reason I say that, and I think it's important for me to say that here and now in this conversation, is because it really is about the confluence of equity and sustainability. Can you actually have a sustainable society when equity is not on the table? Absolutely front and center. And I use the word equity as a proxy for racism because I have a problem with the word racism. It's my personal problem. I'll deal with it in my own time. I'm not putting it on the table here. All I'm saying is when I say equity, I'm talking about exactly the same issues that Raghu was talking about. Okay. Given that, when I step back and ask myself, what is it about the world that I would like to change today? I don't go to racism first. I think that's a symptom. It's not the cause. It's a result, not the reason why. The reason why is historical, I think. I was talking to one of the students today about the whole issue of sustainability and triple bottom line, right? Ecology, people, planet, profit, so on and so forth. Capitalism is the nub of the matter, right? When you say active industries, you're talking about capitalism. And if you talk capitalism, then you have to ask yourself, why is capitalism so entrenched? And the reason it's entrenched is historical. It's because this is how we're accustomed to doing things. This is how things have always been done. That has to change. So we can rail against racism, we can rail against violence against minorities, we can rail against all these things, but at the end of the day, it's only going to change when we change our headset. That's the only way we're going to change this thing. Metrics, yes, it's important to talk about metrics. Yes, it's important to think about metrics. Yes, it's important to create the metrics. That's not what's going to change this. The stories change only when we change the status quo, right? So I think the point I'm trying to make at its heart is this. If we want a fairer society, then we have to be willing to challenge the basis by which we today ourselves exist. Because really, us in this room, we're pretty close to that 1%. We're closer to the 1% than we are to the 99%. I know I am. Just in terms of how I make my decisions. Why do I drive? Why do I live a life that requires that I have to drive? right? Why do I choose to live in a place where I have to drive to the store because that's the only option that's feasible for me? And I have to question those things, and I have to be willing to face up to the fact that I am living a life that is not one in which I'm walking the talk. I'm
Okay.
doing this. I'll shut up.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Ashwani. You gave us
Just have one brief
something to
comment.
think about, and I want to give both of our speakers an opportunity to respond.
Yeah, not being able to consider race, I would submit, is a luxury. It's a luxury that not many people in this country particularly have. So yes, race, it is a social construct. We all know that.
Mhm.
But it is very real, at least in the functioning of this country. For the young man that got shot yesterday, it was largely because he's African American male. He got shot in the back. They weren't looking at things like his whether he was close to 1% or 99% and those kind of things. So those not taking race into consideration in this particular country is a luxury. The issue, yes, in other parts of the world, yes, there's other different forms of oppression and those kind of things. We all know that gender being pretty much patriarchy is normal these days all over the world. But in this country, race is the foundational. It is what this country was built on.
Mhm.
So in a sense, not being able to consider is a luxury that some of us have, but many don't. So when we look at this particular society, we have to consider race. There's no way out of it.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Raghu. I want to learn through this process, but I was struggling with the notion of considering equity, absence of racism, and being able to achieve equity without thinking about that. I think, it's sort of like, how did we get to this point if it weren't for racism? So you got to deal with the reason that there is inequity. So I was struggling with that. Shay, share your thoughts.
I just feel like you don't have enough time. Well, we don't have enough time for my thoughts. Ashwani,
Well, go ahead. You're our guest speaker today. So you and
Ashwani
Raghu, we want to hear from you. So go ahead.
Yeah, Ashwani took me to so many places, right? I mean, I remember when I was like younger and entered into undergraduate institution, and I took my first sociology course, and I thought about like how it's not about race, it's about like economics, right? Like I was really like, it's not a racial issue, it's really about, race seems like the distraction, right? Because really, if it comes down to us coming together across class and really thinking about like different things and engaging across class structures, people will be in trouble, right? So every time, like, I think about how when the Black Panthers started going to Appalachia, the mountains, and started working with, low-income white folk, then they just totally eviscerated it, right? The organization. I think about when Dr. King started working with the labor movement, they assassinated him, right? So when I always, and maybe it's shade, it's the conspiracy theorist in me, but I always think about how that, how people have a problem with us coming together across class and things of that sort. So I will say, so when Ashwani brought that up, it made me think deeper. But, since I've learned so much more, right, I think about how all of these things are interconnected, and the fact that this country, especially, since all of you, most of you are from higher education institutions, was built off, these institutions were built off of slavery, right? They were funded by the board members. What is that? I think I gave you the book last week, Ebony and Ivy.
Yeah.
And really like looking at that book and Craig Wilder's book around that. It's not even like opinionated. It is like, by the way, it's a historical account of how our institutions were built on slavery. I happened upon that book because I was looking at like some of the institutions on the East Coast, and I was looking at the diversity or demographic. I hear somebody's music.
Yes, and let's make sure everyone's muted.
Yeah. So I was listening. I was looking at different occupational statuses at institutions, at higher education institutions, different types, private, state comprehensive, different places like that. And I started to look at the diversity. And so I looked at, so individuals who are like in environmental services, facilities, and individuals who are in like senior leadership, and looking at the diversity across the board. And I was seeing that at these institutions, there is probably like, if you were to look at diversity, or like even the African-American population, just to say that like 1%, like in sort of like senior leadership. And then like if you were to look at like environmental services or facilities or different things of that sort, and I'm not even looking at the skilled trades, I'm just like facilities, environmental services, it was a disproportionate amount of representation, of African Americans in there. And I'm like, so how did that happen? So I started thinking about sort of the great migration stories, and like how people, and so I ran across this book, and I mean, it's just, folks stayed here, right? And have lived here and lived in the community, are still working here, still at, the most financially vulnerable part of our population at institutions. These are the individuals who are at great risk, right? When it comes to us returning to these colleges, based upon, when students come back, these are the individuals that are like the essential workers that are going to have the most contact. And then, so I think about how all of this stuff is sort of tied in. So that's why I could go on, and I know we have to get to other things. And it makes me, go back to that new student that walked on campus in the sociology class and start to think about how those intersections come into play. So I don't think it's one thing or another. This stuff is like interconnected. At the end of the day, racism is an issue that you would, in order to not pay attention to it, you do have privilege to be able to ignore that, right?
Right.
And so I have to agree with Raghu hands down. But there was parts of things that Ashwani was saying that makes me think about equity in different areas, and pulls me to different places about how all of this sort of plays in and works together. So like Shrek, my thoughts around this are layered. Yeah.
I completely understand. That's a lot to think about. And while I do, like you, I think, Ashwani, you raised something for us to think about, but I think, Raghu, you helped us to sort of understand that. And I was sort of thinking, I think even the point of saying that we should focus on equity over racism is kind of, some could see that as being racist in itself, in that it's a form of erasure, which is another type of racism. To say that one thing is further up on the hierarchy, and we need to deal with that. So you're right, it's a lot of things. Someone put in the chat that we've got to deal with all of them, and I think that's where we are. We've got to tackle it all. Time to get to Angela's question. Angela, you have the mic.
Thank you. So my question actually involves a lot of this. I am the Director of Research Administration at my university. And so I am not in the educational piece so much, and I am not in the upper levels of administration, but I'm on a task force to improve diversity within our institution. And sort of like what Shay was saying to me, I look at the web and I want to see how we get down to the actual root and get rid of that. And I have thoughts on that, but what I'm asking is for some practical advice to talk to faculty who have traditionally held these positions of authority, and the microaggression within an institution of higher education is very prevalent. And have people had any success pushing back against the establishment that don't seem to realize that what they're keeping in place is a system of discrimination? And by allowing any form of discrimination, like I think it was Christina said in the chat, that if you allow one thing, you undermine the rest of the efforts, in my opinion. And so how do I speak to this without everybody getting their back up and me losing my job is what I'm asking.
Raghu, go ahead. Looks like you're ready to address it. Go ahead.
No, I'm actually not. It's, but I'll take a stab at it. This is difficult. Shay probably has more experience with doing this successfully than I do. But because this is so countercultural, there is always an element of risk involved in taking these kind of steps. How much to stick one's neck out without losing their job, as you mentioned, there's always a challenge. Because academia, as you used the word, which I used earlier, which is, it is part of the establishment. And a lot of academia is towards maintaining the status quo. So don't rattle the cage, just keep it the way, keep it the way it is, and so on and so forth. In fact, academia gives credibility to the status quo. It gives intellectual credibility to it.
Right.
So, and so a lot of these systems, as Shay pointed out, these institutions were built on slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And it's in their best interest to maintain these structures. It's profitable to them. And it's profitable to certain sections of the society. So so essentially, if we're going to turn the system on its head, where is the pressure point that we can actually take a risk? And that, I have to confess, I don't know if it is this, there's one particular pressure point that is available for all of us. I think it's unique to every institution, but I will let Shay take a stab at that. I'm not able to respond to that.
So Angela, I know this sounds bad, but could you ask your exact question? Because it was
unclear.
Yes.
Okay, so what I'm asking is, I want to look at the entire system of microaggressions and how that impacts everybody in the university. But I think what the establishment wants is to get a couple people of color in the faculty, and that may be just about it. And to me, that is hardly worth pursuing because it doesn't really change anything substantially, in my opinion. And so, like you were saying, Shay, about how people in custodial or groundskeeping, that's where the people of color predominantly are. So in any institution, based on my research, which is limited, that is not a HBCU, the majority of the diversity is within the staff. And so by having this microaggression from the top with the faculty the pecking order, what message is being sent to a student by their advisor berating a staff member, not only because that's not a cool thing to do, but also because they are attacking, in a lot of cases, a minority group as well. So how do we bring that to people's attention without, how can I get that heard, I guess is what I'm asking.
Yeah. I think, so what you're talking about is more organizational change work, right? When I look at diversity, equity, and inclusion and how I address it, and this is to go back to grad school for some of you all, but Bowman and Dill's 4 frames for reframing the organization, right? So DEI that's sort of the conceptual framework I use. So we're looking at it through 4 frames, right? We're looking at the structural, we're looking at symbolic, we're looking at political, and we're looking at the human sort of resource side. That's a side where empathy comes in. And what's interesting about diversity, equity, and inclusion, if you look across these institutions, we do a lot of work in the symbolic frame, you know, the stock photos on the you know, you're like, I've never seen this kid in my life. Where, I mean, he's on the front page, right? So the stock photos, you see, you know, different, you know, we have this center, you know, this person, right? And that also could be too, like a chief diversity officer role, right? Or roles like mine could be symbolic, even for sustainability. You know that, right? Like the inaugural sustainability director, right? And they're taking this seriously. And then you have no budget, right? You don't even have a budget for your office furniture. So, and that's happened. I've actually had to advise people through that. They arrived at an institution and they didn't have money to pay for their own furniture. And so
Wow.
those are you know, that right there is symbolic, right? The political can also be like the appointment of different positions and everything like that. You know, you all know what university politics is and what that looks like. And then you have the structural, right? How do you advance up through the process? What does your pipeline look like? What is your performance assessments and rubrics? How do you give promotions? How do you know, you mentor people up through you know, different areas? Who gets selected to do skilled trades and get in apprenticeship programs? You know, if you're thinking about that side of the work in higher ed and all that. So structural is like, you know, so many different things, right? And then you have the human resource side, which is human relations, you know, engaging across difference, making sure you don't have bullying in the workplace, all those different things. So where do you think people spend most of their time as institutions? I'll go ahead and do it for you. They most of their time in the political and the symbolic framework. Why? Because it's easy, it's quick, it's a quick fix. It gives you great returns because people, that wow factor, that rhetoric, that ooh, like they had a reception for the new sustainability director. You know, it feels so good, right? But they don't spend enough time in the structural and in the human resource side of things, Angela. And that's what you're talking about. So those microaggressions, all those different things, that's great. But they're not gonna, they probably don't know how to do that, right? And then they're trying to figure it out. Who you know, we're trying to figure out who has the DEI magic fairy dust to make it all go away. And then you also have the fact that what's gonna be the greater return symbolically, right? The new professor, the Black professor in chemistry that like 300 other institutions are competing for because only so many graduated, because only so many people were let into the PhD program, to all of the structural stuff that we need to work on and address. So what I will say to you is like, how do you address that, right? How do you address that being where you're at, where you sit with the positionality that you have and the agency that you have? How do you get that up and how do you have that conversation? It starts where you're at right now, what you do have agency over. And it also starts with you working and managing up with your supervisors or talking to different people about different committees that you could possibly be on and different things of that sort where you can bring some of these things up and you can help to work to try to address these things. And it also starts with you talking to people who could be wonderful sponsors or mentors who can actually share this information. There's something extremely skillful about making it seem like it's someone else's idea. And there's no end to the good you can do if you don't care who gets the credit, but really also in every seat that you sit at, and every table that you're at, trying to share some of these different things. And then also, first and foremost, modeling the behavior. Right? Are you critically conscious of how you are showing up in spaces and places and not adding to this as well? So that's the best thing that I can sort of like, you know, tell you in a few minutes. I would love to talk to you about it more, but a lot of it has to do with sort of agency and then also how your organization from a senior leadership level is looking at organizational change.
Thank you.
Wow, that's yeah, that's a lot to think about, but it was very well stated, Shay. Thank you. We have a follow-up question that someone wants to ask a follow-up in relation to Angela's question. Go ahead, Don.
That was a great answer, by the way. So, I mean, you just probably answered half of the follow-up question that I have, but I want to dig a little deeper on Angela's question because it's a great question. And so I want to, you know, as someone who I would have always kind of rated myself as non-racist, but I probably have not, in the last few weeks learned that I probably have not been anti-racist. So what I think Angela brings up is how do we find out what the 1,000 questions that need to be, or the 1,000 problems that need to be fixed are, because it's deeper and different than what we think they are. I mean, I can assume from my position as a tenured white guy what I think the problems are, but I need to be able to ask in a safe fashion and get answers, if I can be helpful, from people who aren't afraid to give me the facts and the realities, so that I can help work on those things. And I don't know how to get those 1,000 questions answered without making it just be symbolic and ticking a box and making it be superfluously political looking. And I want to fix this because the problem is, I believe we have a short amount of time to make an impact, and then it goes back to normal broadcasting. And I really don't want to see that in my lifetime.
So Don, if I can take a stab at this of course is a very difficult question. And one of the reasons why this problem has bedeviled us for millennia, centuries, whatever. So, and I'm going to address this from a sustainability professional standpoint. Given everything that we've discussed right now and the breadth and depth of this problem, as much as I would like to see it fixed, as a sustainability director, that's too much to take on at this point. It's just humanly impossible. But what we can do is start connecting the dots. In fact, that should be one of our fundamental responsibilities, is to connect the dots between the racism, between the inequities, between our economic model, between white supremacy and all that. These are not distinct. They're all very tightly interconnected. So what we can do, and for this particular society, which is American society, to consumer culture. Because consumer culture depends on propagating racism, on propagating gender oppression, the profiting from black and brown bodies, and now increasingly from the lower class white population over here. So unless these connections are made, and these connections with a little amount of patience and distinguishing between, and this is where it becomes tricky, with the incredible amount of information now on the web, distinguishing between what is accurate, what is relevant, and what is BS, that is a challenge. So there is some trial and error involved, but connecting the dots is very, very important if we have to make a case for change. I don't know if that is an answer that you were looking for, but the dots are not adequately connected at this point. And in my profession, sustainability profession, people seem to think, recycling and renewable energy is one thing, and then, racial justice is something else. No. They're all very tightly linked. It is important to connect them so you can make a case for it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Raghu. I was just sitting with that. And I think that's why we're having these conversations, because we have to make those connections. Shay, you want to weigh in, or should we go to the next question?
I did want to weigh in, because
Okay, go ahead.
when Don was talking, the first thing I can say quickly and briefly is you're going to have to read more. You're going to have to research more. You're going to have to do more. You're going to have to do, when people always say, do your own work or whatever, you're going to have to do so much more to find out this information while we're in this moment, right? As we're seizing this moment. And I felt like that sense of urgency, right? Because you're afraid that the door is going to be closed. And as Raghu has been talking about the status quo and going back and returning, many of us have been using, the pandemic as a reason to not have to concentrate on that. Yeah, as soon as I get over this return to work, COVID-19 policy type stuff or whatever, then we can talk about the race stuff, or we can talk about the sustainability stuff, or whatever is going on in the world. And no, we have to fly the plane while we're building it, right? We can't, nothing's gonna wait, right? We have to address this all at once. So I would go back to the read more, research more. And you talked about the 1,000 things that you don't know, right? Like, how do we ask the right questions to figure out what you know about what you don't know? And I asked myself as you were asking that question, that if I give this to you for you to hold, if I give you those, and for some people, those are traumas, right? If I give this to you for you
Right.
to hold, what I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis, what will you do with it?
Right.
What are you going to do with it? And will you be able to forgive yourself if you realize there's nothing you can do about it? You don't have the power, you don't have, all you can do is sort of listen. And for people who are consistently, having people offer to hold their traumas, but also not hold their joy, it can be exhausting, right? So like, what are you going to do with it? And that's why I always ask when people who want to do the surveys or the metrics and get all this data, what are you going to do with it? And so that's what I would ask you. But I feel like if you are reading, you are actively listening to somebody who wants you to hold something for them, that's the best sort of thing that you could do right now. And then question and ask yourself and reflect on, like, what do you have the ability to actually change, right? And what spheres of influence do you have to be able to make an impact? Because, folk who have this to give and have been, grappling with this for so long, it's hard being disappointed. It's hard sharing over and over again when it's not being taken or addressed.
Yeah. Shay, that was so powerful.
If I may, Kim, just one.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Raghu. Go ahead.
The other thing is when it comes to reading, as Shay rightly pointed out, we also have to recognize the diminishing or the lack of recognition for Black scholarship.
Yeah.
Okay. So because knowledge is largely considered, knowledge production is considered a white business. So there's a diminishing of Black scholarship. I mean, Malcolm X, who was, genius. I mean, there's no words, who was in prison, read the dictionary and all that and all. I mean, that's a bona fide scholar, but he's not considered one. Okay. So,
Yep.
So the diminishing of Black scholarship, Latino scholarship, even women's scholarship plays a big role in propagating the systems of power. The traditional knowledge production is considered white business.
Yes.
So recognizing what is authentic in terms of scholarship is a big deal for all of us. And that's one thing. And then looking at America's history, I mean, global history, but since we're here, I mean, history and conventional history is a joke. And people who don't know their history are condemned to repeat it. So, so we have to look at, what the history and get to the real history of this place. And then also recognizing authentic scholarship. And then also recognizing what is BS. And there's a good bit about that out there.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I would do.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, Raghu, because we're not going to find this, you won't necessarily find it even at your own institution. You're going to have to do your own digging. And I can't say anything better than what our two presenters have said, so I won't do it. But I think that this is an excellent time to share this one-page document that we created here at AASHE, because we sort of had this notion that folks were going to be wondering, all right, so we've had all of these discussion series, now what can I do? And, as Shay and Raghu have pointed out, this is not something that is going to be solved overnight, but we sort of thought these are some things you can do the minute you leave this webinar. You got to start learning for yourself. You've got to start, doing the work of it. Take one policy at your institution and start asking questions about it. You can read that for yourself a little bit later, but just to give you some think abouts to get you going until we get to dealing with some of the heavier things. But to reiterate what Shay said, this is a moment in time, and I think that we have to get up to speed rather quickly, because pretty soon it'll be something else that the world will want to pay attention to. After all, we've been here before. The civil rights movement did not produce racial equity and social justice, and that lasted, more than a few months. So I encourage you guys to take a look at that, and don't forget the resources that we've also put on the, Nakia, if you can just drop that in, or anyone who's from AASHE on the call, just drop that link in as well, because it's full of Black scholars. And, you know, the Black community is always considered a number of folks, Dr. Claude Anderson, Francis Cress Welsing, you know, scholars that perhaps you guys have never heard about, but we have always, you know, held them in high regard. Okay, next question is coming from Adrian.
Sorry, I was muted. It took me a second to unmute myself on my iPad. I can never find that button. At McGill, one of the things that we worked on was within our institute. McGill is, like, I always joke that McGill is the whitest white space in Montreal, and it probably is. So my job, I chair the subcommittee for racialized and ethnic persons at McGill. And what we work on is the policies that are supposed to drive the university towards a more inclusive space for the racialized community. But it's always struggled with that because it involves admitting that it is in fact not an inclusive space, which is not something that our institution is really strong at doing. So what we decided to do was to show them that the reality that the rest of the world lives is also being lived at McGill by running our own numbers. And what I mean by that is we took all of the statistics that look at how students evaluate our teaching staff and demonstrated that the systemic bias and racism that you see out in the world is reflected in how our students evaluate our teaching and learning staff. And that explains in part why there's so few racialized professors, why there's so few racialized even contract academics. They systematically get lower reviews, lower ratings than the rest of our teaching staff. Once the university was able to see that they couldn't deny that the reality of the rest of the world was true at McGill, we looked at how we could address that internally by adjusting both what we accept as valid criticism within our student evaluations of our teaching staff, and also how we measure them to try and at least level the playing field in a way that would allow for bridging that gap and bringing more and more racialized people into the teaching space at McGill. It's slow going, but it's working. But one of the things I think helps a lot when you're in a particularly non-racialized university environment is showing them their own numbers.
Okay. Raghu or Shay, you want to react to what Adrian had to say, or? And Adrian, I didn't hear a question in there, but I just want to make sure that if you have a question.
It was more to the effect that, I say that in part because we've talked a lot about the American space. I'm actually not in the US, I'm in Canada. Okay. And often what happens in Canada is that we deflect because we're not American and assume that where we are, it's fine because we're Canadian, and we often, by comparison to the US, say things are fine here. And so it was less of a question and more of an observation that, you know, people don't necessarily know what's happening in their own house. They compare themselves to whoever is worse than them and say, at least we're not them. Canada does that a lot. And in our university spaces, it's particularly bad. And so by showing our own numbers to our own people, we were able to demonstrate that, you know, we have not escaped the legacy of being founded by a slave owner, by having that systemic bias permeate our own space. And it's important to be able to show the reality of the space that you're in to the people who think they're immune.
Okay. Yeah.
I was gonna say to Adrian, like, that was a whole word, so I didn't need to add anything to it. But one of the things it made me think about as we were having the discussion before is you know, we've talked a lot about the outward things, about doing stuff, you know, to address the system and all these different things, right? And what Adrian just said made me go back to what I've been thinking, is that power of one, and like let's start with us first, right? Let's start with the person in the mirror, right? Like it's really important for us to look at that first as we're doing our systems work too, because when we go out into the world and assume sort of that leadership role, and we haven't handled our own stuff and done our own work, it hinders the impact and sort of the power that we have to be as effective as possible, right? Because people are going to question, like, okay, how is it that you are not modeling the behavior when this is something that you're advocating for? So thank you, Adrian.
Kimberly, you're on mute again.
I'm sorry. Next question is coming from Lisa Mitton. Go ahead, Lisa.
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question for Raghu, and I was wondering, you've talked twice about consumer culture embedding in systems of oppression. And so when I'm thinking of sustainability office, I'm thinking about maybe our messaging that we could, at least I could be doing even more about alternatives to consumerism, focusing on simplicity. And I'm just wondering what you're saying about consumer culture embedded in systems of oppression. I'm wondering if you could unpack that a little more and talk a little bit more specifically, because there's a lot there. And just to bounce off of you, because I think it might be related, I've been trying to think about what, as a sustainability office, we can do and how to intersect intersectionality with environmentalism. And so the kind of questions I'm asking myself are, where do our materials come from and where do they go? And how does that impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Not just talking about electricity and how much we consume, but like where that electricity and where that natural gas comes from, and like locating that in communities and finding intersections with Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And so that's what I'm thinking about when I think of consumerism and systems of oppression. Also, like, where does our hazardous waste go? So, Raghu, could you unpack that a little bit more?
Okay, hang on, Raghu. Before Raghu answers that question, I would like to ask everyone, just put your hands down, get off a chat, go on mute, because you need to pay attention. I wanted you to pay attention to everything, but this is really deep. And I want to give Raghu a chance. Take your time, Raghu. Take a couple of deep breaths. Take your time and lay it out for us.
Well, Kim, you probably inflated that a bit much, but I'll do my best to live up to it. But thank you for the question, Lisa. And this, in my opinion, particularly for the sustainability profession, is the big question, which is to connect consumer culture to systems of oppression. So I'm going to start with myself over here. For example, the shirt that I'm wearing right now, most likely made in a sweatshop in Bangladesh by a woman of color, a Bangladeshi woman of color. So the reason I have about 50 of these shirts is because, well, I get most of my stuff at Goodwill, but in the event that I actually buy it in a store, I probably get it for 20 bucks or something like that. And I can have 100 of these shirts if I want to. So because I can afford them. But the reason I can afford 100 of these is because, one, because the Bangladeshi woman there was paid $2. She was paid $2 per hour to work on this thing. So wages that were due to her have been essentially stolen from her. And I can buy this for cheap, so I can increase the amount of disposable income that I have over here. And so I can afford to go on vacations. I can afford to go on, whatever. I can afford to buy 20 more shirts of this kind of stuff. I can buy fancy this. I can eat out in restaurants. The person who's paying for that is that Bangladeshi woman over there. She is paid for my lifestyle over here. So the imperial lifestyle, which is the lifestyle over the American lifestyle, is essentially parasitic. So we are essentially benefiting from their, and by and large in today's world, these are largely Black and brown bodies spread out all over the world. In sweatshops, I mean, take for example our bananas. Our bananas we can get for 50 cents a pound or 60 cents a pound, but they're largely grown in Honduras or Guatemala. And how much are the fruit pickers there overpaid? $1 or something, per hour or something like that. So essentially what is due to them is stolen. And that is how wealth here is generated. And I can go through a bunch of commodities like this. So essentially those people of color have no mobility. They're shackled, generationally shackled. There's no way out for them. And because our economic model is considered natural, like it fell from the sky, we don't question it. And so this is where black and brown bodies are constantly kept subjugated. And they can't break out of it. And this is one of the core issues of sustainability that all of us, I'm giving just a 30,000 foot view of this, but for every commodity we can dig into this, whether it's extraction of fossil fuels. A lot of the materials that goes in our cell phones, coltan, for example, which is a rare earth mineral, comes from the Congo. Do we know what conditions the people working on over there? So essentially for this culture, with this population, which is 4% of the world's population, consuming 30% of the world's resources or thereabouts, and then generating 30% of the world's waste, a lot of this is based on that extraction and exploitation and dispossession. And for the wealthy and even middle class over here, the disposable income that we have is essentially because we have taken from those people. Africa is the world's richest continent in terms of resources. Why does it have so many poor people?
Right. Right.
Because it's stolen. So likewise with Asia, I come from a colonized land, India, where everything was ransacked basically. That's why we have to migrate. A lot of this migration is fueled by this kind of behavior. So these are the connections that we need to make if we have to make our profession really, really powerful. Or else we'll only recycle. We'll only be doing, solar power and, lead and all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying that's not important. Yes, we have to we have to do those things. But unless we address consumer culture, then we're really not getting to the root of, and basically consumer culture here was fueled by slavery. Free labor, fantastic.
Right.
Nothing better than that, right?
Right.
So these connections we have to make within our profession. And this is where, in a sense, it all comes together. The gender oppression, the racial oppression, the various other kinds of oppression, they get tied into consumer culture, essentially.
And a larger carbon footprint.
Yes. And so, the US carbon footprint, as it's the largest in the world. If you look at historical emissions, China is now the biggest emitter now, but historical emissions and historical footprint, the US is the largest in the world. So that's where, thank you, Kim, that's where we can tie all of this in. So that's why dealing with racism, dealing with equity is so important. How many of us want to work in a sweatshop?
Right.
How many of us want to go and dig in the mines for rare earth minerals? We don't want to do it. Why do we expect others to do it and benefit from them? And a lot of this, like for example, the picking of fruits and all that, the farm labor also happens in California. There are Latino workers by and large over there. So this is where the racism, the oppression, the systems of oppression are tied into the consumer culture. And unfortunately, there is no curriculum that covers all of this at this point. It covers in bits and pieces, and maybe there's some radical faculty here and there that deal with it, but they don't tie this in together. This should be across the curriculum. This is where academia essentially is lacking. I feel it's lacking by design. It's deliberate. Because it's part of the establishment. If you make this transparent, then you can dismantle consumer culture. So this is where we need to tie all of this together to make our profession really powerful. Otherwise, we're always going to be working in operations. So I hope I answered your question, relatively okay, but I'm happy to expand.
I think you gave us a lot. Thank you for just laying it out like that, Raghu. I don't know if you can see the chats, but somebody just said, well said, Raghu. That's, if you still need to connect the dots on this, then I encourage you to just watch this watch this webinar all over again, this discussion, when we put the recordings out. And you know what, Raghu, I was thinking when you were talking, I didn't want to go because I wanted to stay fixed on what you were saying, but oh, I know what it was. It was sort of on the lines of you mentioning being in the curriculum. And one of the things that I learned about today was that the University of Pittsburgh was going to require a racial justice course for all first-year students. And as I read the article, and I don't know if this is a big deal, but it's going to be in the Department of Sociology. And I'm wondering if we as a sustainability community should be either working with departments of sociology, or should we be focusing on adjusting the curriculum for environmental studies, for example?
So Kim, I'm on board with all of this. I'm absolutely on board with all of this. I want to touch upon what Shay mentioned. There is a bandwidth issue for us.
Yes, absolutely.
There is, we're understaffed departments with, no budgets frequently, as Shay pointed out. So there is definitely a bandwidth issue. The solution, and I saw one question, what is the solution? Well, if I knew the solution, I'd be somewhere else right now. I have my thoughts about a solution, but like I said, I want Shay to chip in and everyone else to chip in. While there is a knee-jerk reaction to jump onto a solution for most people, and that's commendable, we do want to get a full grasp of the problem, though, understand the problem, because most of us, to a very large extent, haven't, in many ways connected the dots. I'm still connecting the dots over here. Okay, and then please bear in mind that we're essentially looking, for lack of a better term, to transform the system. I mean, consumer culture is essentially, it's existential for this society.
Mm-hmm.
I don't shop, who am I? I am my consumption.
Yes, yeah.
Okay? So we're talking with something that is almost hardwired into people over here. But what I'm submitting is that we can graduate to a better quality lifestyle with a much lesser impact, both on other people, a negative impact, a brutal impact rather on other people, and a lesser impact on the planet. What I'm submitting is it is possible to have a better quality lifestyle by strengthening community bonds as opposed to focusing on consumption. I mean, if consumption was the holy grail, why do we have, the opioid crisis and the mental health crisis and all this? I mean, you have most people, I won't say everybody, most people have pretty much everything they need. But they still, there's all this depression issues and mental health issues and, opioids and alcoholism and all that. So clearly it's not working. All the consumption is still not enough. So it's about time we looked at other metrics of the, the good life.
Yeah.
And we need to look at building stronger communities for everybody, inclusive of everybody, not just a few people, not gated communities. But stronger communities for everybody. I submit that is one way of approaching this problem. That will build a more egalitarian society and also reduce the absolutely obscene levels of consumption that we have over here. And then miraculously, you'll find that your recycling levels also become better. Your consumption level drops. You're not putting so much crap in the landfill. You don't need so much power because you're not making crap that you don't need. So this is where, we have to do a much better job of connecting the dots.
Yeah. Okay.
So if anyone is confused, please reach out to me afterwards, but I'm happy to elaborate on that.
Okay, great. Shay, do you want to chime in with anything before we switch gears?
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. I want to acknowledge Marshall Curry for putting in the fact that the California State University system is doing a system requirement for ethnic studies. I did read about that too. It's a couple of other schools out there doing similar things. And one of the things that AASHE is working on is just pulling together a list of universities that are doing any kind of initiative around racial equity and social justice. We just couldn't pull that together fast enough to get it ready for today's call, but even though we know there's no perfect model out there, but just for you all to know what others are doing can help you in your journey. And then the last question I want to take is, I see Victor. Hi, Victor. Welcome to the call today. That Victor put a comment in the chat that I feel is important to address. And Victor writes, it seems to me that global equity is not the same as racism in America, where a particular set of people were enslaved and denied certain rights and opportunities. The more we globalize the issues of American racism, the more we seem to minimize the issue we are facing in America. How come no one talks of reparations as a social sustainability solution? And Shay, I'm going to ask you maybe to address that first as the DEI professional.
I mean, they're not, they're not lifting up social sustainability as or reparations as a social sustainability issue because they don't feel like we're going to get it. They don't feel like it's going to happen, right? I think a lot of people don't have faith in and feel jaded, by that particular discussion. As a sort of a descendant of individuals who were displaced and I can't even think of had extreme violence against them from the Tulsa race riots. My family lived in Tulsa and were displaced because of the 1921 race riots, and our family went to court and tried to get at least some of the property back, or the value of that property, or some sort of thing from that back, and sort of getting dismissed left and right on a technicality, to now, like recently here, a lot of people didn't even know that this was something that existed, and still, like, if we could get an apology, a appropriate apology, and be compensated for that or whatever. I know all too well firsthand about what does reparations look like. Reparations for our family look like not even a real gold medal, but a plastic medal of distinction and a citation, in the form of a certificate. So that was our reparation. So I think the reason why people are not, seriously considering that, because, like, how do you repay that, right? How do you, how do you address that? And it would be, people don't want to, sort of pay the price. I think about Georgetown, right? Georgetown, like what they recently did, and how they tried to restore, and through their, sort of commission and the things that they did to try to repair the harm that was caused, which still, of course, wasn't enough or whatever. Those are individuals that are actually taking those leaps and making those, sort of gestures towards that. So I don't want to talk about it too much. I mean, it would be a good idea, but the question is do people have faith that it will be time well spent? And this has sort of been an argument for some time, and many people are still sort of grappling over what does reparations look like too, right? We can talk about it, but what does that look like? And then one of the things I think was, we talk about global equity. I saw that global equity, and then also racism in America. And it talked about globalizing the issues of American racism. That stuff, we only have so many minutes left. It's 12 minutes left. It's so interconnected. We cannot think of ourselves sort of in a vacuum, but at the same time, we do have to think about home, right? Like, we do have to think about, we're so busy sometimes thinking about across the pond, that we don't think about our issues here and what we need to address. But we cannot, again, it's one of those issues where you're flying the plane while you're building it, because there's so much interconnectedness in the issues that we're facing and what other populations around the globe. I mean, I think about issues around anti-Blackness. This was something, why do you think the world came out in the streets? Because of this, because it impacts. And why do you think you think America's the only one that's handling, or the U.S. is the only one doing anti-racist work, or really coming to grips with some of these different things? Like this is you know, pervasive, and it is a global issue. So really trying to make sure that we think about that, but I totally understand about how we need to address issues of home, because what I do watch us do, and this is at a micro and a macro level, is not deal with ourselves and how we participate in it. So how do we dismantle a system that we are complicit in and that we benefit from? You know, that's what I hear Raghu when he said everything, you know, that's what sat with me, right? How do we dismantle a system that we are complicit in and benefit from? And how do we come to grips with the fact that we're talking about ourselves, right? We're quick to be like, maybe that person over there, or like, we get a little bit of knowledge around diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we want to be the first ones to be, you know, have just enough knowledge to be dangerous and tell the person next to us like they need to correct this. Well, I'm going to get biblical on you and say, get the telephone pole out your eye before you come get the toothpick out of mine, right? We need to do our own work, right? Because we are a part of a bigger system. And we're only willing to make sacrifices until it gets uncomfortable for us, right? Until we start experiencing that discomfort. And then that's when we want to sort of draw the line and not move anymore, right? Like how many of you would give up your CEO seat because you felt like your organization was not, didn't have like diverse perspectives? They needed new, fresh leadership with different, sort of like different representation in terms of identities. You know, how many people will walk away from that particular seat and do that, right? How many people, you know, would go out and actively recruit someone on your condo or your home association board because you realize that there wasn't any, you know, folk of color on there to inform the policies that are impacting your neighborhood? Like how many of you actually would give up that position or power to do that, right? How, you know, I'm thinking about like sacrifices and that are structural and maybe like doable, that actually you have to make some hard decisions for, right? And so, you know, ask yourself that. How do I dismantle a system that I'm complicit in and I benefit from? You know, that also has to do with like the tables that you sit at now. How are you contributing at the table to dismantle, you know, or to actually, you know, be anti-racist? How are you leveraging your skill set around being anti-racist at the tables that you sit in now, right? Especially if that means that you end up becoming that person. Like, oh my goodness, here comes Lisa again, here comes Nakia again, here comes Raghu again, there they go. You know, and so they're all over, like they having happy hours and over here and you over there because you're actually leveraging your seat to try to change some of these systems, some of these structures and process. Are you willing to sacrifice that? Are you willing to give that up and not be the in person, or not be, you know, the popular person, right? Because you're calling people in. I'm not saying that you need to get, you know, you need to be mean about it. I'm saying that you know, I have a lot of people who talk about, you know, I should be on that committee because of my seniority and my experience. Well, I don't care about your seniority or experience. All I care about is how you're leveraging that. How are you using that positionality and power to make a difference, to change some of these structures? You know, it's not about you deserve or you're entitled to that seat at the table. Every day you're earning that seat. And if you cannot speak up for those who are, you know, disenfranchised, marginalized, minoritized, all of those, you know, categories, I could go on, then you need to rise and fly. You need to get up and let somebody have that seat who's actually going to go in and do that work. If you're exhausted, if you're tuckered out, if you don't have any more in you, take a break, come back to it later. But you need to make sure that there are folk that are there that are lifting up those voices, that are trying to make change, that are bringing fresh new insights, all those things. So I know that was a long-winded way to answer this, but I felt moved to say it.
I think that's great, Shay. And Raghu, do you want to just give a closing comment real quick? Otherwise, we'll go ahead and wrap this up. Okay, I was gonna say you're on mute, but go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that, I've enjoyed discussing this with you all. This is an ongoing process. It's not just a 4-session process. I hope you folks understand that. This is, all of us have to contribute to this. Solutions, as I think Victor asked, like, what is the solution? Well, the solution has to be developed. It's still in the process of being developed. As Shay said, we're flying this plane. I never heard that before, but this aircraft while we're building it. Shay also pointed out that we all have to look at ourselves in the mirror, very important. But another component of sustainability which we need to build upon is civic engagement. So while we are in the process of questioning our own actions, investigating our own actions, there's only so much individual action, only so many straws you can recycle. But you also have to look, while you're thinking about taking action, you want to look at civic engagement, participating in the democratic process. These are also very important parts of sustainability, which unfortunately we haven't been given enough treatment so far. But if we're going to graduate to a healthy society with a consensual decision-making process, a democratic decision-making process, we have to be civically engaged. Yes. And that's another area which this society is having some trouble, I sense. But we have to be civically engaged so that we can all participate in the development of a healthy society. So I don't have much more to add beyond this, but I'd love to continue these conversations. I want to thank AASHE for organizing these. Fantastic job, AASHE team. Proud to be with you guys. I'll hand it over to Kim.
Okay, so before we leave, thank you. First of all, this is the last of our discussion series, and I'm going to ask Megan to kind of close us out. But before we leave, Shay and Raghu, can you just stick around for 1 minute after Megan closes out? And then I want everybody, let's just show appreciation to Shay and Raghu, and they'll accept the appreciation to all of the folks who have been a part of these discussion series. But today was absolutely amazing. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Back to you, Megan.
Well, I'm passing it on. Thank you all, but I'm just passing on what I learned from other people. So it's essentially appreciation to everybody else.
That's how we'll solve this. Everyone has to learn and do the homework, and we can share it with others and teach our families, friends.
Absolutely. Well, Kimberly, I will just echo your gratitude for Raghu and for Shay, who we've both, I've worked with both of you now for several years, and I'm just so grateful for you to bring your perspective, your knowledge, your wisdom to this call today, but really throughout this series. And as Kimberly said, this is a starting point, not an end point at all. Kimberly, as head of our marketing, in addition to membership and meetings, has a lot of plans coming up in the next couple of weeks to share with you a lot of the amazing content at our conference. But this theme around racial equity and social justice and how sustainability change agents need to be deeply invested in anti-racism work is going to be subject matter throughout our conference. Truth and reconciliation will be a theme and one of the keynotes. I really, really, really am so excited for you all to hear about more of the content that we'll be showcasing at our conference. We've gotten a lot of suggestions throughout this series for various ways that we can continue engaging our community around this content. So know that we have a lot of work to do internally to figure out how we can still identify specific strategies for us to, again, continue engaging you all to improve STARS and offer a lot of other programming. So we are working to try and do that amidst everything else. And again, my gratitude to both Kimberly, who spearheaded this, this series, as well as Nakia on staff, Nakia has led our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts for a decade at this organization. And I could not be more grateful to both of them for all of their leadership in this space. And AASHE we are learning every single day how we can continue to lead and center racial equity and social justice. And we're looking to bring our entire community along with us. So my gratitude to you all for being a part of this conversation. Like Shay said, you're here, you're interested in learning, and keep digging into that Google Doc that has probably over 100 of resources that has been pulled together for you all to continue doing the work that you're doing and the important learning and unlearning that has to happen. So with that, y'all, thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day. Stay healthy, stay safe, stay sane, and keep doing the good work you're doing. Bye, all. Some folks might not realize they might have just tuned over to something else already.
Yeah, I just, if there was a way, I want to end, there we go.
Sorry, that's me. I'm gonna leave. Sorry about that.
Oh, it's okay. Normally we would, let's stop the recording.